Alright guys, we're going to drop back and punt a little bit when it comes to this. My projector blew, so for this week, while we are trying to fix the projector, we are going to do a flipped classroom. What a flipped classroom means, in essence, is that the easy stuff, the notes and stuff, you guys do on your own. So I will upload these videos to Google Classroom, and you will follow along at your own pace, getting your notes the way you can go back and rewind or whatever you need to do. You get the notes at your own pace, and then we save the class time for doing the harder type stuff, the document analysis and the Cornell notes I'm going to teach you guys how to do over reading. So this is your warm-up for today. This is What Was Seward's Folly? We're going to do a quick review, and then we're going to jump into the Spanish-American War. Okay? So, U.S. imperialism, we started talking about this today. Okay? And that is really U.S. expansion. Okay, that is imperialism. It is the United States building an empire. Now, the U.S. foreign policy was, at the time, based on something called the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, the Monroe Doctrine is something that had been around since 1823. It was President Monroe was the one who came up with it. And President Monroe basically was worried about particularly France and Spain taking over more and more colonies in the Western Hemisphere, which is like South America, Central America, Cuba, the Caribbean. So Monroe came out with this doctrine or this edict, and he said that no European country was allowed to set up a colony in the Western Hemisphere anymore. Okay? He specifically says that further efforts by European countries to colonize land or interfere in North or South America would be viewed as aggression, which would require United States intervention. Now, quick side note here, we didn't have the power to back that up. We had a very tiny little navy. Our military was still in its baby stages, so we did not really have the resources we needed to be able to defend that. But Britain did, and Britain was not interested in colonies in the Western Hemisphere more than what it had. But Britain was interested in keeping Spain and Portugal and France weaker, so Britain backed us up until we were able to enforce this ourselves. There was only one time in American history when the Monroe Doctrine was challenged, and that was whenever France took over Mexico during the U.S. Civil War. Napoleon, yes, that Napoleon, he sends over troops to Mexico to put his brother on the throne of Mexico. This happens during the Civil War. As you can imagine, we've got a few things going on already we're not really thinking about. So we deal with the Civil War, and as soon as the Civil War is over, U.S. troops are pulled from the southeast where they were fighting, and they are sent into Mexico to kick out the French. So it was challenged once, and we backed it up. We kicked the French out. So that is our foreign policy. Our foreign policy is, you don't bother us over here on our half of the planet, and we won't bother you over there on your half. So we get to police the Western Hemisphere, and we basically didn't interfere with Europe too much. Okay? Now there's a new issue. The new issue is, should the United States have its own empire? Okay? Should we go out and take our own colonies? This is what we talked about this morning, or yesterday if you're watching this in class. The Americans' basic belief about expansion, that was that manifest destiny. Okay? Manifest destiny said that it was God's will for the United States to expand. Okay? Now, one of the things you do need to know is a book called Turner's Frontier Thesis. Okay? Turner's Frontier Thesis was written by Frederick Jackson Turner, and it's actually got a big long name. Most historians just call it the Frontier Thesis. And in this, he says that what had made the United States so great so quickly was that the United States was constantly having to deal with challenges that no other country had to deal with. So anytime we would try to expand our country, we were running into new things we had to deal with, right? So first it was the Mississippi River. How are we going to cross the Mississippi? Then it was, we have this huge amount of territory. How are we going to keep all of the different states connected? Then it was Southwest desert. How do you live there? How do you function there as a society? And eventually, and then it becomes, well, we've got continent to continent. How do we keep people connected? And what America had done was find ways to deal with those problems, from steamboats to transcontinental railroads to telegraphs and telephone lines. We had found ways to deal with the challenges of the frontier. Only now we own California, so there's really no frontier left for us. And what Turner's frontier thesis said basically was that America would now go into decline. Well, if there's no frontier left to challenge us, then there's no reason for us to constantly be pushing forward with our technological advances. So the United States had two options. It could take over colonies and let the colonies be our new frontier we're having to contend with, or we could stop and just go into decline. Somebody we talked about this morning, Alfred T. Mahan, wrote The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. In this, he says that Congress had to fund a modern navy. Remember, he called that the Great White Fleet. He also said the U.S. must colonize to expand and protect our trade. And the third thing he said, which we didn't talk about a lot in class today, but you do need to know, is the fact that he said the United States had to build a canal across Central America. Okay. At the time, at the beginning of U.S. imperialism, the United States only owns two possessions outside of the contiguous United States. Contiguous is a vocab word. It means bordering or touching. Okay. Those two things we owned before imperialism were the Midway Islands in the Pacific. Okay. We annexed those, or we took them over. Okay. In 1867. And they are going to become a coaling and repair station for U.S. ships. Senator Albert Beveridge, in that speech we read in class today, where he talks about there will be more coaling stations coming to us, that was like Midway. Midway would become a coaling station. It was a place where ships could stop to take on more coal so that they didn't have to carry all the coal with them, which left them more space in their ships or in their holds of their ships for goods that they were trying to buy and sell. The second place we already owned was Alaska, and that was William Seward, which we talked about today. We bought it from Russia in 1867. William Seward is the one who purchased it for President Johnson. And remember we talked about this, it was called Seward's Icebox or Seward's Folly. That's your answer to the warm-up, by the way, y'all. Okay. So if we look at what we have going on here, okay, ignore the fact that this is a map from World War II, okay? We owned this island right here. We own the Midway Islands. Okay, I don't know if y'all can see the cursor or not, but I'm circling it like crazy right now. The United States is interested in two things, okay? We want trade in Asia, specifically trade in the Pacific, okay? We wanted trade in the Philippines, which was a Spanish colony, and we wanted trade in China. The problem with China was that China was already divided up into spheres of influence that were mostly close to the United States. So China at this point had weakened to the point where different European countries were basically controlling small sections of China, and they didn't want to allow the U.S. in. Okay? So we want trade in Asia. We're just not quite sure how we're going to get it yet, because right now every place we're looking at is controlled by another country. The second thing we wanted was Hawaii. Okay? That's the cloud is the definition of spheres of influence, by the way. Hawaii was already under the control of the Americans. We talked about this today. In 1810, which Hawaii became a country, it was unified by King Kamehameha. Okay? 1819, the first New England whaling ships arrived. Remember we talked about that? They come and see the half-naked people running around on the beach and decide that was something to go home and talk about. They did. They went home and talked about them. And the Puritan streak in New England ran hard back in the day. And 1820, less than a year later, New England missionaries showed up in Hawaii to start converting the natives to Christianity. Okay. Now, these missionaries, they're going to stay. They're going to bring their families. They're going to get married and have children. And their descendants are going to be less focused on making the natives Christians and more focused on making themselves money. So they create a cash crop economy in Hawaii. And the cash crop, you need to know, is sugar. Okay. Most people, when they think Hawaii, they think, pineapples or whatever. But sugar was the cash crop. The problem with this is that there wasn't a lot of labor available on Hawaii, mostly because the natives refused to work for the white people. So one of the things that the white missionaries' descendants will do is they bring in Asian immigrants to Hawaii, mostly Japanese workers. They bring them to Hawaii to work on these sugar plantations. It gets bad enough that by 1920, only about 20% of the population was still Native Hawaiian, which means out of everyone living on Hawaii in 1920, only 1 in 5 of them was actually Native Hawaiian. So 4 out of the 5 were descendants of someone from somewhere else. All right, so this is the Queen Liliuokalani. I showed you paintings of her today in class. Today you see the photograph. She takes power in 1891. The previous king dies, and she was a distant descendant of him. So she takes over in 1891, and when we're talking about her being a staunch Hawaiian nativist, so she wants Hawaii to be strong and a powerful country on its own. She supports a program known as Hawaii for Hawaiians. This is basically calling for self-government. She wants to kick the white people out of power in Hawaii. Sanford Dole, this guy with the lovely bisected beard, okay? Sanford Dole, he's the guy who leads the rebellion in 1893 that deposed the queen, okay? Deposed means to force someone out of power. Now, this is illegally supported by the U.S. Ambassador John Stevens and the U.S. Marines. Remember we talked about in class today that the Marines were basically bamboozled into helping the white people depose the queen. John Stevens was the United States ambassador to Hawaii, and he basically calls the Marines and begs for help, saying that they're being attacked by the natives. Come save all the Americans. So the Marines do what the Marines do. They show up and think they're protecting everybody and take over the government to stop the coup, only there's no coup to stop. So that's a little bit of mud in the Marines' eyes. Now, the question is, Sanford Dole takes over. Sanford Dole writes a new constitution, and his cronies write a new constitution for Hawaii. And the question becomes, will we annex Hawaii? Will the United States annex it? Would we take it over? It goes to Senate. President Cleveland starts to ask the Hawaiian people, and President Cleveland says, no, we will not annex it because it was not the choice, the wish, or the will of the Hawaiian people. They did not choose to be annexed. They do not want to be annexed, and they will not be annexed. Okay? So if you look at other ways, okay, so we're not going to get Hawaii yet. So what are some other ways we could get into the Pacific? There are 2 people who are standing in our way. The first one is Spain. Okay? The problem for Spain is they are too weak to stop the United States. They have spread themselves too thin. They have too many colonies they have to keep troops in to keep control of. So they don't have enough troops available to fight off the United States if the United States was trying to step up and take anything over. Now, our major competitor in the Pacific was Japan. Okay? Japan had been opened up previously by Commodore Matthew Perry. That's the gentleman you see on the screen. He sails into Tokyo Harbor and demands that Japan allow the United States to buy and sell goods, which basically forces Japan to industrialize before it's ready. As a matter of fact, Japan is the only Asian country to industrialize before World War I. Now, the problem Japan has is it's an island. and it's not a particularly big one. So they are extremely limited in their resources and raw materials. So for Japan to function as an industrialized society, they had to become imperialist. They had to take colonies. They had to make those extractive economies we talked about in class today. Okay? Now, that was the review. Now we're into the new stuff. Okay? The door to the Pacific expansion. Okay, if we want to control the Pacific, we actually have to control the Caribbean. And I know that sounds really, really weird, but I will explain it in a second. Okay? And if you're going to control the Pacific and you're going to follow Mahan and have a Panama Canal, you got to control the Caribbean so you can control the canal. And if we're looking at places we can control in the Caribbean, and the weakest link, the one that would be easiest for us to take over, is Cuba. Now, Cuba is a very poorly run Spanish colony. Okay? They are incredibly poorly run. Cubans, like the Filipinos, often rebelled against Spain. And yes, Filipinos is spelled correctly there. I know you spell Philippines with a PH, but Filipinos is spelled with an F. Okay? They're going to rebel often against Spain. They're constantly in a war for independence, and the Cubans were too. 1895, Cuba, led by a man named Jose Martin. Nope, I'm sorry, that should be Martí. Take the N off. He rebelled against Spain. Okay, so this is another war for independence. Only this one's getting a little bit harder for Spain to win. Remember, we talked about Spain being spread too thin. So the only way for Spain to win was Spain had to use very brutal guerrilla tactics to win. So the Cubans are fighting in guerrilla warfare, which, if you know anything at all about warfare, guerrilla warfare with the UE is whenever you do the hit and runs. Think what the Native Americans did to the colonists. Think what some of the best battles the Americans fought against the British. Anytime two forces meet on the field of battle and they march off onto the field and shoot at each other, the group with the biggest army wins. Almost always, because it's going to be whoever has people left standing when the other side's all dead. So it's not going to work well in the Cubans' favor because the Cubans have a smaller army than the Spanish. So the Cubans have to resort to guerrilla tactics, which is what our soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq are facing now. There's no way to tell who the enemy is. They don't put on a uniform. Okay? They don't march up against you and say, hey, I'm against you, I want to kill you. So the Spanish didn't really know who the rebels were and who the normal Cuban citizens were. So in response, the Spanish just waged war against everybody in Cuba. And unfortunately, that's the only way to win a guerrilla war. You just have to kill everybody. Okay? Now, the head of the Spanish forces, the head of the troops, the Spanish forces in Cuba trying to fight off the Cuban rebels, is this guy. His name is General Valeriano Weyler. Okay? They called him the Butcher. Okay? And he, in Spain's name, is going to use concentration camps to control the Cuban people. Okay? Hitler did not invent concentration camps. We have used them. Spain has used them. Germany, of course, has used them. Actually, it was a pretty common thing at the time. Now, a concentration camp is a prison camp for civilians. If you're putting soldiers in them, they're called POW camps, not concentration camps. They're called prisoner of war camps if they have soldiers in them. So the concentration camps in and of themselves, not necessarily a bad thing. Like, everyone's done it. It's a way to control the population, right? If you don't know who the enemy is, you throw them all into a camp, put a fence around the camp so nobody can leave, and it doesn't matter if they're the enemy or not, they can't hurt you now, okay? The problem is the way that they were treated in these concentration camps. They weren't fed. Children were taken away from their parents. Families are going to be separated. People are going to die in horrible numbers. That little boy you see in the hospital bed is still alive. Like, that's the amount of starvation you see going on here. The reporter you see there, he is standing on the bones of the people who have died in one of the concentration camps Weyler set up. These are the types of things you see in the newspapers that give General Weyler the nickname of the Butcher. Okay? I mean, and think about that scale. That is a full-grown man. Yes, he's sitting, but that is a full-grown man. And look at how far that mound of bones goes out behind him. Okay? That picture that just popped up, that is General Weyler touring one of the concentration camps. And what you see on the ground, all around him, those are all the dead bodies. The way these concentration camps were set up, if you left or tried to leave, you were killed. If you managed to get out and then tried to sneak back in, you were killed. Now, keep in mind, these people, they're not necessarily sneaking out to go be part of the rebels. They're sneaking out because they're starving, right? They want to go find food. A lot of these people are wanting to go hunting or fishing, and they're not allowed to. So they sneak out to try to find food, and they get killed that way. Now, the American public opinion, right? This is a horrible, horrible situation, but really it's a situation between Cuba and Spain. So how does the United States get involved? And this is when the media becomes an issue. The American public opinion was molded by two newspaper publishers. And they had two different newspaper chains, and they were competing in a circulation war. Okay? A circulation war is a war over who sells the largest number of papers. Okay? So the first guy you have is William Randolph Hearst. He controls the New York Journal. Fascinating guy to talk about and to learn about. He actually bought a castle in San Simeon in California. That's it. It is huge. And Orson Welles actually made a movie about him that he hated so much he tried to buy up all the copies so he could burn them all. It was called Citizen Kane. I recommend you watch it if you ever have time. It's wonderful. It's about a newspaper editor who does horrible, horrible things in order to get his paper to sell, and it basically chronicles Hearst's career. And Hearst didn't like people knowing that he had done things that were so shady. Alright, so this is San Simeon. I would like to live there. I mean, who wouldn't, right? Then you have Joseph Pulitzer. Okay, Joseph Pulitzer is the editor of the New York World. So he is in competition with this guy, Hearst, okay? Pulitzer is the guy that sets up the money that is still used today to award the Pulitzer Prize for journalism, okay? So they're fighting against each other. They're both trying to do whatever they can to sell more papers than somebody else. There's a couple things they're going to do to influence Americans. And the first one is they're both going to use sensationalism. Okay? Sensationalism is a vocab word. You must know what it means. Sensationalism is whenever you use... Sensationalism is whenever you stretch the truth or you use clever wording tricks to make things sound more important than they actually are. It's when you lie, guys. You make up stories to sell papers. You see this every day whenever you're in the supermarket and you look in the trashy magazines there. You know, I had an alien's baby or whatever the headline is. You know it's not true, but it's there to catch the reader's attention and to try to get you to buy the paper. Okay, so it's exaggerated. They take a fact and they stretch it out of proportion, or they just make up facts altogether. Now, using sensationalism to attract readers was and still is known as yellow journalism. It's the cowardly way of doing it. Okay, especially today, it's called yellow journalism. It's seen as if you are a journalist and you cannot back up your reporting with facts and figures and evidence, then you're lying. And that's not something a journalist is supposed to do. A journalist isn't supposed to make up the facts. They're supposed to report on them. The second thing Hearst and Pulitzer both do to influence Americans is they're both going to draw parallels between what the Cubans were going through with Spain and Americans' war for independence against the British. You're going to see a lot of political cartoons and articles that talk about, how brave the Cubans are being for trying to fight off the Spanish. Okay. This should be 3 and 4, not 1 and 2. They are both going to focus on the cruel tactics of Butcher Wilder because, let's face it, murder sells papers. So the more they talk about Butcher Wilder, the more people are going to buy the papers to read what's going on. And both of these men, interestingly enough, were war hawks. Okay? A hawk, we still use this term today, is a term for a politician or a member of the public who, generally speaking, has a first reaction towards any problem of using force. We usually call them war hawks because their answer to problems with other countries is to go to war with them. So they're more of a, hawks are more of a use force first type of person. Both of these newspaper editors are going to be hawks, which means they're not going to be talking about friendly, let's have sit downs with Cuba and Spain and see if we can work this out. There are not going to be gentlemen's agreements here. They are going to be urging war with Spain or Cuba. Okay. Hearst has his own little ace in the hole. Okay. His name is Frederick Remington. He is the gentleman you see on the top picture. Remington was a photographer and an artist. And he is sent to Cuba to cover the war. He's sent there to take pictures of the battles and the troops and the horrible things that are going on, to paint the pictures of the major battles and send them back so Hearst can publish them in his papers. And there is no way of proving this is true, but it's been reported enough that most people study it, that Remington, after he had been in Cuba for a while, realized there wasn't really a lot of animosity. Well, there was animosity, but there wasn't really a large push for a massive scaled war. Remington didn't think America was going to get involved. He really just wanted to come home because, let's face it, Cuba was miserable at this time of year. It's hot. It's muggy. Half of the island is a swamp. There's mosquitoes everywhere. And he sends a telegram to Hearst, and he says, there will be no war. Basically, there's not going to be a war. Can I come home now, please? Let me go. And Hearst reportedly sent a telegraph back to Remington in Cuba that said, please remain. You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war. Right? So basically, you keep sending me pictures of things like the concentration camps and the horrible things Wilder's doing, and I'll get the American public stirred up enough that we're forced to go to war. Okay? Pulitzer's going to take a little bit less visual approach. Instead of taking pictures of these things, he's going to hire an actual writer to go to Cuba and cover the war. His name is Stephen Crane. Stephen Crane's pretty young when he goes to Cuba, and he is a war correspondent. He will be there through the war, and it is his job to interview soldiers who are coming out of the battles and people who are wounded, and it's his job to be as close to the action as he can so he can report on it. Now, Stephen Crane, when he comes back, he's going to have issues from viewing this war. Remember, this kid's not a soldier, right? He's a writer. So he deals with what a lot of historians today are come to a consensus of being PTSD. And one of the ways he dealt with it was to write about it. Now, he's not going to write specifically about the war, mostly because nobody at the time wanted to read about it. So he writes a fiction book called The Red Badge of Courage. It's a really good book. You should read it. And his book is set in the Civil War. But what's important about The Red Badge of Courage is it is the first book that ever portrays battle realistically. Up until Stephen Crane wrote The Red Badge of Courage, almost all the time whenever a book would be about war or a war would be mentioned, it was always the romanticized version of war. Right? It was always young soldiers going off to fight for freedom, right? It was going off to fight for what's right and make the world a better place. But they never actually mentioned the blood and the guts and the torture of war. And he does in The Red Badge of Courage. He really does vividly describe what a battle looks like, what a battle feels like and smells like. And this is the first time anyone, not just Americans, but anyone really gets to experience that through literature. Okay? So the question on everybody's mind is, should the United States intervene? Should the United States step in and get involved in this fight? And the public opinion, more and more and more, is saying, yes, we should. President McKinley at the time, remember, he's a politician. He doesn't like to pick a stance because it might make half of the people who vote for him angry, says, maybe we should get involved. Okay? And then there's going to be even more pressure put on America to get involved. The Cuban leader, Martin, he directs the guerrilla attacks on American-owned properties. Okay? The Spanish get smart. And the Spanish basically start parking all of their stuff on American-owned properties. And so if the guerrillas want to take out Spanish supplies or Spanish weapons, they want to bomb that stuff, they have to bomb those American-owned properties. And America can say, maybe we don't need to get involved in this until American-owned stuff starts getting blown up, right? So in January 1898, McKinley orders a U.S. battleship, it was the USS Maine, to Havana Harbor in Cuba. Okay? Now, its only job, the only job of the USS Maine, was to protect American properties. Okay? They were not supposed to get involved in the war. They were just there to protect Americans in Cuba and American property in Cuba. February 9th, 1898, you have another big shocker. Okay? Hearst publishes something called the De Lome letter. Okay? This was a private letter written by Spain's ambassador to the United States to Spain's ambassador to Mexico. Okay? So it's two colleagues, right? Both of these men are Spanish citizens. One is basically Spain's voice in the United States, and the guy who is receiving the letter is Spain's voice in Mexico. And what the Spanish ambassador is saying in the De Lome letter is, we have to keep America out of this war. So he's trying to convince the Spanish ambassador to Mexico to convince Mexico to declare war on the United States. Okay? So he says, you tell Mexico that if they declare war on America and try to take back Texas and New Mexico and Arizona, we'll fund it. We'll send them money to help fund this war. And he knows that the Spanish ambassador to Mexico is friends with the Spanish ambassador to Japan. So he says, while you're at it, get in touch with your buddy over in Japan and see if he can convince Japan to declare war on the United States. Okay? And he does that for two reasons, right? The first reason is if Mexico is involved in a war with the United States, then the United States Army cannot take over or cannot get involved in a war. We can't get involved in Cuba because our troops will already be fighting the Mexicans. And if Japan declares war on us, then our Navy can't go to war in Cuba because our Navy is going to be busy fighting off the Japanese. Okay? So this gets published. The American public is outraged. How dare Spain go behind our back and try to convince other people to declare war on us? And worse, they're going to tell them they're going to fund it. So that becomes an issue. And of course, Mexico, who is just the country, was like, dude, we were never going to do this. This wasn't an don't get mad at us. Get mad at Spain. Right? This wasn't a Mexico thing. This was a Spanish thing. So this, of course, nothing comes of the De Lome letter besides making Americans mad. 6 days later, February 15th, 1898, an explosion sank the USS Maine. 260 American sailors are killed. And everyone's wondering, did Spain sink this boat? Right? Is this a Spanish attack on Americans? The answer here is no. Okay? When they actually managed to raise the boat back up out of the water, the explosion blew out instead of in. And if you know anything about explosions, when an explosion blows out, that means the explosion started inside the ship. So it wasn't a torpedo coming into the ship. It was something inside the ship blowing out. And what most people think happened was they stored ammunitions too close to the boiler room, and the ammunitions got too hot and exploded. Now, is that going to matter to any of these people who are selling papers and trying to make money? No, of course not. Hearst, Pulitzer, most Americans at this time, even though Maine did not sink, or Spain did not sink this boat, and Spain is coming out and saying, we did not sink this ship, we don't believe them. We think they did, and they're going to demand war. Okay, remember, most Hearst and Pulitzer and a lot of American government officials at this time, they're war hawks. They think the first response should always be violence. And their rallying cry is going to be, remember the Maine. All right, so these are some newspaper front pages, okay? Maine explosion caused by bomb or torpedo. Of course, we know it wasn't, but there you go. My personal favorite is the illustrations that they do it, okay? With the ship blowing up, men falling to their deaths, okay? Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. $50,000 reward for the detection of the perpetrator of the Maine outrage. By the way, they never actually had to give that reward because, you know, it was not an attack. Okay. So this was the World. This is the Journal. Okay. Now, when the Maine sinks, does McKinley have to do something? Yes. He is the president of the United States, and now you have the majority of the country thinking we were just attacked. He has to do something. So his response is to send an ultimatum to Spain. Okay, and an ultimatum is an either-or demand. Parents are really good at this. Either you do this, or I will kill you. Okay? That was my mom's favorite ultimatum. What I give my son a lot is either you pick up your toys, or you don't get your tablet. Okay? Doesn't mean either choice is a good choice, right? It doesn't mean you want to do either one of them, but you only have two options, so you got to pick one. April 9th, 1898, Spain refused the ultimatum. Spain said no. Okay. Now, the ultimatum he was given, McKinley told Spain, either you sit down with us and with Cuba and talk about a way to end the fighting, end this war, or we will go into Cuba and we will end it ourselves. Okay. So April 9th, Spain refused the ultimatum. April 11th, McKinley does something that is actually kind of rare for a president, even though they're supposed to. He asked Congress to agree to U.S. intervention in Cuba. He basically asked Congress to declare war. Now, there's going to be a huge debate in Congress over this, because the people who were anti-expansionists, the people who were anti-imperialists, those anti-expansionists, they think that this war would just be an excuse to annex Cuba. They think that America would just use this as an excuse to go and grab a colony, and then nobody else would be able to stop us. So, the way they fixed that is Congress passed something called the Teller Resolution. Now, the Teller Resolution says that the whole goal of any war or intervention that America would take in Cuba would be Cuban independence. Okay? You need to know this. Circle it, highlight it, star it, whatever you got to do. You need to know that the Teller Resolution was a promise that the U.S. would not annex Cuba. The United States would not make Cuba a territory or a colony. Once that gets passed, April 20th, Congress voted to intervene in Cuba. Now, this is not a traditional declaration of war. Okay? We're not going in and declaring war against Spain and we're taking the side of Cuba. The way Congress worded this was America was going to go to Cuba and stop the fighting. Okay? We were going to intervene. We were going to get both sides to stop shooting at each other so we can figure out a way to end this. Okay? Not a declaration of war. The problem is Spain took it as one. So 4 days later, Spain makes the ungodly mistake of declaring war against the United States. So we go into this saying we're going to be an impartial judge. We're not going to pick sides, even though we probably would have. We're saying we won't. And Spain makes the mistake of declaring war against the United States. which, by the way, opens up all Spanish possessions to the United States, not just Cuba. So now it's not just a Cuba issue. Now it's a Cuba issue plus any Spanish colony we feel like taking while we're at it. And if you remember from the beginning of this video, there was one Spanish colony we wanted, and that was the Philippines. Okay. Spanish-American War takes place in 1898. It was a teeny tiny short little war. Okay. And with any war, you're going to look at it and decide, on paper who should win, just like you would with a football game, right? Anytime you bet, there's an over-under, right? Who should most likely win this? If you're looking at the Navy, the U.S. Navy was way better than Spain's, okay? The biggest problem the U.S. Navy was going to have was there was no fast way to get our Navy from the Caribbean, where we were, to the Pacific, where we wanted to be. This is going to emphasize the need for a canal, okay? Now, the U.S. Army was way worse than Spain's, but fortunately, most of this war is going to be fought on the sea. Spain just doesn't have the ability to get ground troops to their colonies fast enough to fight off the U.S. Navy. First fighting in the war, by the way, does not take place in Cuba, because we already promised we wouldn't make Cuba a territory, which means Cuba is no longer a priority for us. Now we can go take territories we want. So May 1st, 1898, U.S. ships commanded by Admiral George Dewey, who was the first hero of this war, destroyed the Spanish fleet in the battle at Manila Bay. Okay. Now, the Filipinos are going to help. Okay. They're led by this kid. Well, he's not a kid. He's in his 20s, but he's led by this guy, Emilio Aguinaldo, who had already been fighting off the Spanish. So keep this in the back of your mind. Okay. The Filipinos were already fighting the Spanish. They were already in the middle of a war for independence. And then the United States shows up and says, we're here to help fight off the Spanish. Okay. July of that year, Congress annexed Hawaii, specifically to give the U.S. a permanent naval base in the Pacific, so that we didn't have to worry about going down around South America anymore. Hawaii officially becomes a state in 1959. Okay. So this is Manila Bay. We go in here and we basically trap the Spanish. They can't get out. Okay. The Caribbean theater. We're going to bounce back and forth a little bit. You've got the invasion of Cuba. Spanish forces held the high ground, which is where you want to be whenever the grounds are swampy. Americans are stuck in the low-lying areas, which when it rains, all the rain's going to come downhill along with everything else, and you're going to be stuck in a swamp. The greatest killer of American soldiers during this war is yellow fever. You should remember about this time, about 20 years earlier, the yellow fever epidemic in Memphis, and 17,000 cases, killed more than 5,000 people. We still don't know what's causing it. Okay, we don't know how to, and we also don't know how to stop it. So, basically, anyone who gets bitten by a mosquito stood a decent chance of catching yellow fever. Okay. Now, the most famous action in Cuba was the all-volunteer 1st Cavalry. They were nicknamed the Rough Riders. Okay. Now, they were not actually commanded by Teddy Roosevelt. That's a myth. He was a volunteer commander, but he was not the actual commander. Roosevelt, whenever he and his buddies got together and made themselves a cavalry unit, they were smart enough to actually get somebody, get a military guy to be in command of them. Now, during this battle, Roosevelt was in charge because their original commander had been field promoted up, so Roosevelt had to take charge. Now, their target was Kettle Hill. You almost never see it called Kettle Hill. As a matter of fact, I've seen teachers teach this wrong. It is not Kettle Hill because, it is Kettle Hill, but most people have heard it called San Juan Hill because that's how the newspapers reported it at first. Okay. They did not take San Juan Hill. They took Kettle Hill after 2 days of fighting. And actually taking Kettle Hill could not have been done without a lot of critical support by the 10th Cavalry, which were the Buffalo Soldiers. They were the 9th and 10th Cavalries were America's black cavalry. They were all black units under white commanders. But they don't get hardly any credit for this, even though they did most of the fighting for 2 days. All of the credit for taking this hill is going to go to Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, mostly because Roosevelt was really good at PR. So after the war, he writes this big, long book about being part of the Rough Riders, and these are all the amazing things I did. As a matter of fact, Teddy Roosevelt wrote a friend after this saying, I deserve the Congressional Medal of Honor for this, and I want it. And then not too long after that, he managed to get the Congressional Medal of Honor for his fighting on this hill. Famous pictures, you've got the two paintings you see, those are both Remingtons. Painting, the Rough Riders charging up the hill, taking the hill. On the right side of your screen, the top picture is an actual photograph of the 10th Cavalry. That was actually taken in Mexico when they were looking for Pancho Villa. And then underneath it, that is the actual emblem of the 10th U.S. Cavalry, still around today. That's still the emblem they use. But that's the Buffalo Soldiers. Okay. Lots of Teddy Roosevelt propaganda here. You're going to see lots of him in his military regalia. Okay. If you notice right here on his collar, it says USV, U.S. Volunteer Cavalry. Okay, Rough Riders actually weren't owned by the military in any way. They just chose to follow the military rules. What you see here, right, Allied, yeah, okay. What you see here in the very middle, right underneath the American flag, that's Roosevelt. And this is his Rough Riders mixed in with the 10th Cavalry Buffalo Soldiers. Okay. All right, Teddy Roosevelt becomes the greatest hero of this war. Okay, he wins the Congressional Medal of Honor for this. August 1898, Spain asked for an armistice. An armistice is not a surrender. An armistice is a permanent ceasefire. Okay, it's an agreement to stop the shooting while you work out a treaty. And they do. By the end of that year, you have the Treaty of Paris. Okay, this is one of about 5,000 treaties of Paris you'll have to know in my class this year. We talked about this before. The way treaties work, you find a country that was not involved in the fighting, and both sides go there. And then that country is responsible for hosting the dignitaries from both the warring countries and keeping everyone safe. Okay, so everyone went to France to discuss this and to work out the treaty. Okay, in this treaty, you need to know, in the Treaty of Paris, Cuba becomes independent. That was our promise. We got it done. Okay, U.S. promise of the Teller Resolution. But Spain still lost. So Spain has to give America something. And Spain will cede or give away Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States. Okay, Puerto Rico is in the Caribbean, and Guam is in the Pacific over near the Philippines and Japan. Okay. U.S. also agrees to buy or purchase the Philippines. So Spain loses. Hey guys, you lost. How about I give you $20 million? It's kind of how that went. We wanted the Philippines and we bought them. Couple of reasons why. The main reason was that at this point, other countries were starting to look at Spanish colonies, wanting to know what they could grab up. And Philippines were looking good to a lot of people. So if we didn't buy it, the Philippines probably would have been taken over by either Japan or Germany, and we did not feel comfortable with either of those two countries owning the Philippines. The second reason is that thing we talked about today, that white man's burden. Okay, that belief that God created whites superior to all other races and gave them the job of educating, civilizing, and Christianizing everybody else. Okay. Now, so what did Filipinos want? Independence. Okay. Filipinos, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, they had fought for independence. This was the Philippine War. Okay, from 1899 until 1902. So we will stop fighting Cuba, and then we tell the Filipinos, guess what? We bought you. You're our colony now. And doesn't make you happy? And the Filipinos were like, no, that does not make us happy at all. We want independence. That's why we were fighting the Spanish. And our response is, well, we're not the Spanish. Would you be cool being our colony? And they said no. So for a while there in the Philippines, You have men who were fighting, who were like sleeping next to each other and fighting on the same side one day, 3 days later, are shooting at each other. Because you had American troops and Filipino troops who were allies, and then a couple days later, all of a sudden, the Filipinos are fighting to try to kick the Americans out of their country. So that Philippine War from 1899, it lasts longer than the Cuban War, than the Spanish-American War does. Mostly because the Philippines are fighting for their home territory, and the Spanish were fighting for a colony. And you always fight a little bit harder for your home territory. That's why the South kept in the war in the Civil War so long. They didn't want to give up their own homes. Now, a lot of Americans did not like the fact that we bought the Philippines because it goes against basically everything America stands for. One of Americans' major beliefs is that we believe in the consent of the governed. We believe that the government has to be beholden to the people. That's why we vote, right? We vote to give the government consent to do certain things. And we didn't give the Philippines a chance to decide if they wanted us to be in control or not. Now, those Americans who don't like this are going to join the Anti-Imperialist League, which are going to have some really big, heavy hitter names. Mark Twain was an anti-imperialist. Henry James, another major author, was an anti-imperialist. Booker T. Washington was an anti-imperialist, only he was anti-imperialist for a different reason. He said that the United States needed to concentrate on fixing its race issues at home, especially civil rights and equality for Black Americans, before they ever tried to go someplace else and take over somebody else. Okay, so to sum up, was the Spanish-American War good for the United States? Yes. As a matter of fact, the Secretary of State of the time, his name was John Hay, he called this a splendid little war. Okay, and he called this a splendid little war because America had managed to gain an empire at a relatively small cost to us. U.S. war deaths were under 6,000. 379 died from battle. Okay, and that is either they were killed on the battlefield or they received a wound in battle that then caused them to die later. But 5,462 are going to die from disease and other types of infections. Most of these are going to be yellow fever. You do have some dysentery and some malaria thrown in there just for, fun. But most of the diseases that are going to kill people are yellow fever. Okay. So, U.S. empire. Because of imperialism. We owned Midway and Alaska already. Okay. Because of this war, we take Hawaii officially to use it as a permanent military base. The Treaty of Paris gives us Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. By the end of 1899, we will control Wake Island and American Samoa. Those are both other places we take for naval bases. And we will pick up with that stuff tomorrow.